Resources Revealed book. I want to turn for a second to page 5. Yep. Page 5. Okay, I want to just read a paragraph with you. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the 3 different versions of the 10 Commandments. Anyone?
Remember 2.
I know, I was thinking, gee, I missed.
So now we got 30 instead of 20.
You got it wholesale.
No. 30, 20, 15, 10. Okay. That was in the original make. He took that out. Okay. Look on page 5. And do you see the paragraph that starts the final main source?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Paragraph.
Someone want to read it? Just the paragraph?
Okay.
Go ahead.
The final main
Hold on,
source.
I gotta escape. Oh.
I knew it.
He just whispered that to me.
Now I gotta escape. The final main source is known as D because it takes up most of the book of Deuteronomy. More specifically, Deuteronomy comprises 1, a law code that takes up chapters 12 to 26, known as DTN. 2, an introductory text that precedes this law code and casts the book as the farewell speech of Moses before his death, taking up chapters 1 to 11. And then, I assume that's 1 to 11 and not 1 to Roman 1 and 2.
Looks like 1 to 2.
Yeah, that looks like Roman numerals, but okay. And then a continuation of this text following the law code, taking up chapters 27 to 30. 3, 2 old poems that are included as a parting message from Moses for the future, chapters 32 and 33. And 4, reports of the last acts of Moses, bringing together portions from all of the sources, J, E, P, and D. D is part of a longer work known as the Deuteronomistic History, say that 3 times fast, DTR, which includes the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges 1 and 2, and Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. Thanks. DDR contains sources that are as old as J and E, or possibly even older, but the formation of the work took place in the reign of King Josiah of Judah, circa 622 BCE. It was later extended into a slightly longer second edition. This took place during the exile that followed the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah by Babylon in 587 BCE. The original Josianic edition of the Deuteronomistic History is called DTR I-1, and the second exilic edition is called DTR2.
Okay. If I needed to break down Deuteronomy for you, that's like the most concise summary I can give you. Okay, so rather than say it myself, we'll just let Friedman say it for us. And what you're seeing here is that Deuteronomy is actually a text that was probably written over a period of several hundred years, but doesn't really become enacted or even redacted in its final form until King Josiah, which is around the 600s BCE, just prior to the destruction of the first temple. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why one of the prophets that's associated with the book of Deuteronomy is Jeremiah. And the reason that Jeremiah is associated with it is because Jeremiah was presumably living during the time prior to and during the destruction of the first temple. And so it's not exactly clear who wrote it, although it's clear that it's coming to view for everybody in the reign of Josiah, but also around the time right before the destruction of the first temple and just after the fall of the northern kingdom. Okay? What I want to do with you today is I want to look at 3 versions of the 10 Commandments. They're all different. You may not have even realized that one of them was 10 Commandments. They all come from different authorship. They all have different purpose. And if we have time, we will look at the Shema. Okay? Now, if we're looking at the beginning chapters of Deuteronomy, according to this exercise, we would say that we're going to be looking at what we'll call DTN2. Okay? Or as opposed to the first part of D. Right? D is the middle section of Deuteronomy. We're going to look at DTN, an introductory text that precedes the law code and casts the book of the farewell speech before Moses and his death, taking up chapters 1 to 11. Okay, the poems we'll look at the very end, but we're going to start here because this is the part that we really know. So let's look at the non-traditional 10 Commandments for a moment. Page 542 in the red Humashim, chapter 34, verse 10. So if you want to follow along in the Friedman, chapter 34, verse 10, is on page 178. Okay, and you'll notice that the authorship of this text that we are going to read is actually J. Put your hand here for a second, and then turn to Exodus chapter 20 in the Friedman, okay, which is on page 153. And you will notice that the traditional Ten Commandments that most people think of when they think of the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus is actually a combination of redaction and maybe P. But it's actually in this italic form, and the authorship may not necessarily be known. It may actually have been a later emendation that comes after the fact. But let's talk first about chapter 34. So, Lou, would you like to keep reading?
Okay, where am I? Back at 5?
I'm going to go back to chapter 34, verse 10, page
Okay.
542 in the red Humashim.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. He said, I hereby make a covenant. Before all your people I will work such wonders as have not been wrought on all the earth or in any nation. And all the people who are with you shall see how awesome are the Lord's deeds which I will perform for you. Mark well what I command you this day. I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Beware of making a covenant with the inhabitants of the land against which you are advancing, lest they be a snare in your midst.
Okay, so the first thing we have here is covenant, brit. Usually when we have covenant, what authorship might we think? It might be P, it could also be J. Okay, and typically when we're talking about covenant, which God are we talking about?
Yahweh?
Yahweh, right? Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Okay, which you'll notice is the God that we're talking about here. And in this case, the covenant starts by removing from their midst all of these other enemies. Okay? So, in a way, it's starting by saying, I am God, and as God, I am going to drive out everyone else from your midst. Now we're going to go to covenant, to commandment 2. Verse 13.
No, you must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, and cut down their sacred posts. For you must not worship any other god, because the Lord, whose name is impassioned, is an impassioned God. You must not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for they will lust after their gods, and sacrifice to their gods, and invite you, and you will eat of their sacrifices. And when you take wives from among their daughters for your sons, their daughters will lust after their gods, and will cause your sons to lust after their gods.
A whole bunch of laws that are connected to don't have other gods, right? And don't worship other gods. And anything else that might be connected to idolatry. Okay, keep going.
Is this, whose name is impassioned, is that literally a proper name?
Yes.
Is that the only time it's used
No.
in the Torah? Oh,
It's actually used in the Ten Commandments.
okay.
The God is El Kana, either a zealous God or a jealous God, or an impassioned God.
What does it mean, this Hebrew for this?
I mean, in modern Hebrew, the word mekaneh means jealous.
Jealous.
But in this case, it's used as zealous, right? Meaning somebody is doing something zealous in a zealous way as a form of worshiping that God. It's actually the reason why Phineas, reacts the way that he does, and he's rewarded for his zealotry, right? They actually commend him because in his moment of zealotry, he goes and he kills people who are worshiping other gods and lusting after other women in particular who worship other gods. So he's praised for his zealotry. Okay, keep going.
You shall not make molten gods for yourselves. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days, as I have commanded you, at the set time of the month of Aviv. For in the month of Aviv you went forth from Egypt. Every first issue of the womb is mine, from all your livestock that drop a male as firstling, whether cattle or sheep. But the firstling of an ass you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. And you must redeem every firstborn among your sons. None shall appear before me empty-handed. 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall cease from labor. You shall cease from labor even at plowing time and harvest time. You shall observe the Feast of Weeks, of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the turn of the year. 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the sovereign Lord, the God of Israel. I will drive out nations from your path and enlarge your territory. No one will covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord your God 3 times a year.
All right, so are you starting to hear pieces of 10 Commandments? You've got Shabbat. You've got all of the festivals which are not in the 10 Commandments traditionally. But what's the reference to the 3 pilgrimage festivals? When you go to your pilgrimage to Jerusalem, what's not going to happen? No one's going to covet your land. Right? We talk about it as not coveting other people. This is in the reverse. People will not covet your land each time that you make a pilgrimage. Okay? Keep going.
You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, and the sacrifice of the feast of Passover shall not be left lying until morning. The choice first fruits of your soil you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
Okay, we're not going to discuss that one because that one's complicated. But what I want you to pay attention to for a moment is look at verses 27 and 28 and listen to what's happening in terms of where the story is taking place. Remember, this is the moment when Moses is back up on the mountain. The golden calf has just been smashed. When Moses smashes the golden calf, what happens right before that? What did Moses do? He smashes the tablets. What do the tablets represent? The covenant. Moses then goes back up on the mountain, and God gives him another covenant. So look what happens in 27-28.
And the Lord said to Moses, write down these commandments, for in accordance with these commandments I make a covenant with you and with Israel. And he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He ate no bread and drank no water. And he wrote down on the tablets the terms of the covenant, the 10 commandments.
Ta-da.
But nobody knows this is the 10 Commandments. And if you look at it, on some level there are similarities to the 10 Commandments, similar language, even similar commands, sometimes even more developed than the others. But according to the Torah, when Moses comes down, he gets a whole different set of commandments.
Actually, according to this, Moses writes the tablet.
Yes, he
Yeah,
does.
right.
That's right. The first time God writes them, and the second time Moses writes them. Okay, look in Friedman for a second. I just want to show you the notes. This is why I like studying out of Friedman's sources, because he highlights some of these differences for you. So on page 179, I'm in the Sources Revealed book. At the bottom, Stan, you want to read the note where it says Exodus 34:14-26?
Is the J text of the 10 Commandments. This is made absolutely explicit in verses 27-28. Write these words for yourself, because I've made a covenant with you and with Israel based on these words. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. The first 2 commandments and the Sabbath commandment have parallels in the other versions of the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Though the wording is different, the other 7 commandments here are completely different.
That's right. Right? We have some parallelism. We have a reference to them being the 10 utterances, or the 10 things, the 10 commandments. But we have a bunch of extra stuff in here that seems to have nothing to do with anything. The idolatry piece is the same. The Sabbath piece is the same. You know, the first 2 commandments, there's a lot of parallels. But the rest of the stuff has to do with pilgrimage stuff. It has to do with kashrut. It has to do with other random things that differentiate them from one or the other. So, which commandments did Moses actually get on the mountain? Or
Got them all.
did he get them all? And there's different authorship. So let's go back now to Exodus. Go back to Exodus chapter 20. And now we're going to read what we typically call the 10 Commandments from Jethro. But we're going to make the argument that this may have been a redaction. These may have been written later. Okay, so I'm on chapter 20. I'm on page 441, the first verse. If you want to follow along in Friedman, it's on page 153. before we even read the text, I want to just look at Friedman's note. By the way, there's a discrepancy in the text if you were to look about who actually goes to the mountain. Is it Moses or is it Aaron or is it both? Right? And it would seem that from the takeaway that the Torah wants you to have is that it was Moses. But if it's a priestly tradition, Aaron may have been there with him. But we also know that that may not be possible because Aaron was down at the mountain dealing with the golden calf thing. So there's a discrepancy there that we're not going to look at, but it's just worth noting. Correct. Take a look at the note on 153 of Friedman at the bottom. There are two different asterisks. Do you see those? Mm-hmm. Okay. Stan, will you read the first those two?
The text of the Ten Commandments here does not appear to belong to any of the major sources. It is likely to be an independent document which was inserted here by the redactor. A slightly different version was used by the Deuteronomicist historian.
The narcissistic Deuteronomy. Okay.
In
I broke my
Deuteronomy
jaw
5.
doing that.
Very good, Lou.
The most striking.
The most striking difference between the text of the Decalogue as it appears here and as it appears in Deuteronomy 5 is the reason that it is given, as the basis of the Sabbath command. Here, it is because for 6 days Yahweh made the skies and the earth and the sea and everything that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. On account of this, Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy, referring to the creation story. In Deuteronomy, it is so, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. On account of this, Yahweh your God has commanded you to do Sabbath day.
Okay, so we're going to look at a couple pieces of the Decalogue, and I'm going to bounce around for a moment because I want to try to put some sources together for you. Okay, so Friedman's arguing that this is perhaps a redacted text that was inserted later, that it may not have been the original Ten Commandments, not clear. But let's at least look at the first part of the Ten Commandments because I want to pick up on what Alvin picked up before, show you about the difference with Shabbat. I want to link it to the creation story, and then we'll look at the Deuteronomic one. Okay? So, someone want to read? Alan, you want to read?
Where are we?
Chapter 20, page 441 is the first verse, and we're going to read through the Decalogue.
God spoke all these words, saying, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name.
Okay, so the first couple commandments have to do with idolatry, right? And falsely swearing by God's name. But you'll notice, not only are there the parallels to creating idols, we have again this idea that God is an Elkanah. That God is impassioned or zealous. Almost to the point that God gets jealous of what?
Other gods.
Other gods. But remember, one of the things that's interesting about the Ten Commandments story, the Decalogue, is who is the God that's talking? What God are we talking about? Yahweh, Adonai. That sounds a little silly. We were going back to kind of the comment that Jerry made last time. It's a little silly that one God is getting jealous of other gods. Are there other gods? Is there only one God? Is this monolatry, meaning there are multiple gods and there's one competing for kind of authority over the other? Is one God more ethical than the others? Do you even need a God to be ethical or moral? That was kind of the crux of that conversation. In this case, it almost seems like Adonai Yahweh is concerned about his place in the world compared to the other deities. So don't go worship them because I'm Not only am I a zealous God, but what do? I punish. This is a theologically challenging text. I punish. Who do I punish?
The generations.
The next couple generations. But don't worry. Eventually, 1,000 generations later, I'm kind and I'm compassionate. There's another place later in the Torah where it actually inverts it. God is first kind and compassionate to the next generations, but to the far generations, if you don't get your act together, there's a lot of punishment.
I have a question. Okay, so this is Yahweh who's speaking, but then the impassioned God is El.
Yes, good. I'm glad you picked up on it. It actually says in verse 5, Lo tishtachave lahem v'lo tovdem. Don't bow down to them and don't worship them. Ki anochi, I, Adonai Elohecha, the Lord your God, Yahweh your God, El Kana. I am an impassioned God. So it does use the generic El here as a description, but it's not referring. It's still referring to Adonai. It's probably referring to it in the context of the other gods.
Okay.
Well,
The emphasis is on your
verse 7 is a little problematic given how Adonai get, Yud Hey Vav Hey actually it means.
Why?
He's answering the question here.
Yeah, right. That's right. In verse 7, it's very clear that there is only one God. Lo tisad Shem Adonai Lecha Lashav. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Ki lo yenakeh Adonai et asher yisa et shemo lashav. Right? Because it's almost like I'm it in this particular case. So, all right. But now let's look at Shabbat. This is the important one. Okay. Ellen.
Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
Okay. So, does anyone know where liturgically this text is placed?
Is it in Genesis?
No, liturgically. Where do we have it in liturgy?
In liturgy.
In the Kiddush.
You got it. This is the paragraph we recite on Shabbat morning after we do V'shamru. Right? V'shamru b'nei Yisrael. Sometimes they won't say the whole thing, they'll just say the end, which is Al Kain Beirach Adonai Yom HaShabbat Vayikadshehu. But this whole thing is the text for the morning Kiddush on Shabbat morning. And you'll notice that what's the reason, according to this text, that we keep Shabbat? Because of creation. So turn back for a second to Genesis. Hold your one hand in Exodus, but turn back to page 11, chapter 2. If I did this in my Friday morning class, people would be upset because we've really backtracked from the beginning of Exodus to the
Sorry, what page again?
11.
11. You'll notice also
Which
that...
book?
I'm sorry, in the Red Chumash.
Okay.
Chapter 11, verse...
Chapter 11, chapter 2, verse 1.
Chapter 2, verse 1.
If you wanted to see it, it's on page 35 in Friedman. It's very clearly a P story. And at the end of creation, this actually becomes the first paragraph for Kiddush on Friday night. Vayechulu hashamayim v'haaretz, right? And you'll notice that this is the impetus for Shabbat. The heaven and the earth were finished in all their array, and on the seventh day God finished the work that he had been doing, and ceased on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it God ceased from all the work of creation that he had done. That's it. So Shabbat, according to this version of the Decalogue, is all about creation. We rest because God rested. We are emulating God through practicing Shabbat. Yeah.
The translation, I've always wondered about this. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had been doing. That would suggest to me, when I read that he did some work on it. He just finished it on the seventh day. So,
Is it a bad
is that
translation?
a translation issue?
I think it's a translation issue. I don't know let's see what how Friedman translates it.
He says God finished his work. Same thing.
Finish.
What page?
35 on 35.
And he ceased. No, and he says, God finished his work that he had done and ceased in the seventh day from all his work that he had done.
But it says, verse 2, chapter 2, verse 2, and in the seventh day God finished his work. In the seventh day he finished his work, which suggests that he was continuing.
Yeah, no,
up
you're
to
right.
and
It's an
including
interesting.
the seventh day.
It's an interesting thing. It says Vayachal. So, verse 2 would seem to read Vayachal Elohim Yom and God completed. Like the work was done on the seventh day. Does that mean that he actually did work on the seventh day? Or does that mean that that day was the day when work was officially done? Meaning, at the end of the sixth day,
Right.
there was no more work.
Obviously, it is a little bit, it's open to interpretation.
Oh my God.
But it's funny because,
Something unusual.
Have we been doing it wrong? all this time?
no, but it says both, because
you
it
can
says
work
on the
half of
seventh,
Shabbat.
the seventh day he finished the work, and he ceased on the seventh day.
Right,
So-
but it still suggests.
Yeah, that's true, that he did
it
some
still
more,
suggests
yeah. In the
that-
morning. he
Yeah,
finished
or at
it.
least until midnight,
Yeah.
perhaps. 'cause
So
he-
what you're saying to me
Johnny
is
the
that I
Eighth Day.
actually should be able to finish my sermon on Shabbat morning.
Yeah, you should.
Well, no, midnight, I'd say.
Midnight.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you've
Not
got,
sundown.
you've got those, well, from
Sun-
sundown to some point.
Uh-huh.
It sounds like that's when he's
Finished
he's
up.
picking up and putting it in the garbage, whatever.
Right. Okay. So
Sorry.
the rest of the Ten Commandments are not so interesting for this purpose, but we can read if you want. You can read them. But what I want to do now is actually want to move to Deuteronomy, and I want to look at the Deuteronomic text.
Can
So-
I ask just a brief question?
Yeah.
You did.
Yeah, this is my second question now is there any other tradition before the Jewish tradition that looks upon the seventh day as holy, or any specific interval like that? Are you aware of that? I mean, is this unique to the Jews?
I want to say yes, but I don't ever remember studying another narrative of a day of rest from creation in my ancient Near Eastern studies stuff. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, so I don't want to say a firm no, but I think this was revolutionary for Jewish tradition, or for Israelite tradition, I would say.
And one wonders why. One wonders why it was so important.
Because it's easier to sell if people get the seventh day off. You have a better deal.
Clearly, I didn't learn anything in school, so yeah, I'm not sure. It's worth looking at. I would
All right,
do a little digging.
I've always been curious about that. What-
Yeah. I did want to just show you one thing in the Exodus text. There are two major differences between the Exodus and the Deuteronomic text. One is the opening word of Shabbat. In Exodus it says Zachor, and in Deuteronomy it's going to say Shamor. So Zachor, like remember, Shamor meaning observe or guard or protect. Okay? And then the second thing that we're going to look at now is what happens in terms of its reasoning. Why do we keep Shabbat? So let's go to the Deuteronomic text. We're going to be in Deuteronomy chapter 5. If you're looking, it's on page 1016 in the red Humashim. And in Friedman,
318.
318. Okay, sure, 318. And it's going to be in what we're going to call Deuteronomy 1. Okay? Now, one of the things that we have learned about... Do you want to open the window? Why don't you just prop it open a little bit? One of the things that we know about Deuteronomy is that Deuteronomy has a significant emphasis on covenant, but it also has a significant emphasis on the vulnerable. And in particular, the narrative or the message of we do X, Y, or Z because we were slaves in Egypt is a recurring pattern. If I remember correctly, it's no less than 36 times in the entire Torah that we talk about caring for the stranger, the orphan, etc. And a large number of those references come out of the book of Deuteronomy. It's almost like there is an ethical stake that is being placed in the ground in the study or of the transmission of the text of Deuteronomy. So on page 1016, in the red Chumashim, you'll notice that our text starts with covenant before going into the Decalogue. Marilyn, you want to read?
No,
Okay, that's fine.
I can't see.
You can't see. Julie, you want to read?
Yeah, where are we? I'm sorry.
So let's start.
Number 2, okay.
Yeah,
got
let's
it.
actually start on chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 5, verse 1, so page 1015.
Okay. Moses summoned all the Israelites and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the laws and rules that I proclaim to you this day. Study them and observe them faithfully. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It is not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, the living, every one of us who is here today. Face to face the Lord spoke to you on the mountain out of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to convey the Lord's words to you, for you were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain, saying, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image, any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord, your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name."
Okay, so let's pause here for a second. Any major or striking differences between the Exodus text, Exodus 20, and this text so far?
The beginning.
What about the beginning?
When it says, oh, I heard something about why we were doing this.
Yeah, it's very similar. There's really no substantive differences in the first few commands between Exodus and Deuteronomy. Stan, was there something specific that you were hearing?
Yeah, but I must have been hearing things.
The expression is certainly different. I mean, the other one there is more sort of fire. You know, there's more anger
Yes.
and jealousy,
So,
and there's a different
good.
sort of flavor.
So the content is not necessarily different, but the audience and the circumstances are different, right? Remember, according to the way we would traditionally read the book of Exodus, when does the Decalogue scene happen in our story? When is Charlton Heston going up to the mountain and getting,
After the golden calf.
well, not necessarily. So Alvin brings up a good point. There's a discrepancy in the text as to when the Decalogue happens. Did it happen after the golden calf? Does it happen before the golden calf? According to the way the Torah is laid out, it happens before the golden calf.
And then the second one is after.
Ah, good. Glad you brought that up. So if we look at it the traditional way, they've just left Egypt. They've just split the sea. They just had the plagues. They're now free. And they're wandering for about 6-7 weeks to get to Mount Sinai. And then you have this fire and brimstone, shofar, cool, light show, where they get the 10 Commandments. While Moses is up on the mountain, they're building the golden calf. He comes down, he smashes the tablets, and then he goes back up and he gets another set of tablets. That's the part that we read first. So Alvin's right. Maybe the story happens after the golden calf. In which case it would make sense that the first iteration was redacted into it. Right? It would actually make more sense from a theological perspective and from a historical perspective. They leave Egypt, they're out in the wilderness. Moses says, you know what, I'm going to go up on the mountain, get these laws. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, all the people are building a golden calf. Holy crap, guys, what are you doing? We just left Egypt. We got one God now. I can't believe you're doing this. Smashes the tablets that he was in the middle of working on and go gets a new set. The question, though, is that if there was a first tablets, what was on them? So maybe the redactor throws in the 10 Commandments. But what we actually get are the second set of tablets which nobody pays attention to. At least from our perspective, nobody pays attention to. What were you going to say, Phil?
So in the book, how the Bible became a book,
Uh-huh.
he talks about the acquisition of literacy. And
Yeah.
if you'll notice on 10:15, verse 5, he says, "Hear, O Israel."
Yes.
So the Decalogue is being spoken here.
Yes. And one of the very common refrains in the book of Deuteronomy is Shema Yisrael. Over and over and over again. I don't remember how many times, but you're right. There's this sense of an oral tradition being conveyed. And in this case, who is the tradition being spoken to? Who's his audience?
The new generation.
It's the new generation who didn't go there. So it's an interesting thing. If the first generation came out of Egypt, which version did they get? Did they get what we would call the Decalogue? Did they get that other version of the Decalogue? Maybe they never actually got the first set of tablets.
That's right.
In which case, all of those people who've been trying to put the Ten Commandments on their Supreme Court buildings or whatever, they got the wrong set.
Two things. One, Friedman's translation of chapter 20.
Wait, which
Okay.
in Exodus?
Yeah, Exodus 20 and then Deuteronomy 5 is virtually identical.
Yes.
to what we just read.
pages, Luke?
153 and 319. The difference, the main difference is we've got the introductory paragraph in Deuteronomy
Yes.
by Moses explaining why we're doing this.
Yes. And not
I
only
think that's
not
what you were talking about.
yes, and not only why are
but
we
the actual
yes, the actual
text is,
content is almost
yeah,
identical.
word for word.
What's different, you're right, is this introduction. And what does the introduction contain? It contains two elements. Shema Yisrael. By the way, we haven't had Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad yet. That's coming up in the next chapter. So listen to what I'm going to tell you, and a reaffirmation of the covenant. The reason you're getting this stuff is because it's covenantal. The second version, or what we looked at today as the first version of the Decalogue, was all about the covenant. Whereas Exodus 20, what we usually call the Decalogue, had nothing to do with the covenant. Okay, now let's look at the Shabbat comparison. So take a look back in Deuteronomy, page 1019, verse 12. And let's look at the change. There are a couple of very significant changes in this text about why we keep Shabbat. Julie, you're reading. Please.
Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the seventh day.
Good. So, what's going on? What's different? Let's
One
see.
is about liberation.
And one is about
creation.
good. So the first text is all about the reason we keep Shabbat is because
Creation.
not just creation, but God created the world and then rested. Okay? According to the Deuteronomic text, why do we keep Shabbat?
Because of what God did for us.
Because of the Exodus from Egypt. Great. What else is different?
The name of God is Lord your God,
Is more what?
is Adonai Elohim everywhere. The name, the Sabbath of the Lord your God is that Adonai
Oh, the
Elohim.
Adonai Elohecha is there too.
Okay. 11.
No, you're right. There is no Elohecha on the first one. At least not off the top of my head. Go ahead.
No, isn't Anachi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim?
Yeah, that's the same in Deuteronomy, yeah. But there's one other major difference, and it's the word Shamor and Zachor. In the first instance, it was remember to keep the Sabbath holy, which is linked to creation. In Deuteronomy, though, it says observe the Sabbath and keep it holy, and everything that was commanded to you. Why? What is it that we are observing?
The holiness.
God commanded you.
We're remembering to observe this command, and also who else is responsible for observing this command. But here's what's really interesting about this text. Look in verse 15. Verse 15 employs the word zachor as well, but it's for a different reason. The zachor of Exodus is about remembering to keep Shabbat linked to creation. In this case, it is remembering to keep Shabbat because
of the Exodus.
Memory serves a different purpose for Shabbat in Deuteronomy than it does in Exodus. V'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. But here's what's interesting about this. It's in the singular. You need to remember that you were a slave. It's not in the plural. It's each and every single person.
Well, I mean, we're 40 years past here.
That's right.
So he's got to do this. I mean,
Yes.
in the first case, they knew it. I mean,
They were the actual
present.
slaves.
Good. So that's a great reason for why we don't need it in the first place. Okay? Whereas this case, you have a whole generation that's been removed from the Exodus. I need you to remember that this is your story. That's a great answer. Okay? Any other reasons?
Well, you could say, and this is stretching maybe a point for a sermon, but you could say that the creation is mirrored in the Exodus in the sense that the creation of the Jewish people really begins with the Exodus.
Nice. Nice.
I mean, the crossing the Red Sea is like being born.
Great.
Coming out of the womb.
Great. Right? But I think there's one other piece. The impetus for Shabbat is not only about you and you resting, but it's about you taking responsibility to make sure other people rest. Every single person is included now in this text, right? Look at all of the individuals that are enumerated in this text.
Your family and your employees.
Lo taseh chomalacha ata, you, ubincha, your sons, ubitecha, your daughters, va'avdacha, va'amatecha, both the male and female servants, v'shorcha, v'chamorcha, v'chol behemtecha. It names your ox and your ass and all of your cattle. The whole asher bisharecha, v'gercha asher bisharecha, including the stranger or the resident alien, right? That's in your. Every person needs to rest.
I would think that idea is totally revolutionary to any other culture.
It may actually have been.
The idea of the landed person resting, maybe,
Right?
but everything.
Everything. Yes.
So, going back to Exodus,
Yeah.
I'm looking at in Friedman.
Yep.
He also says, I mean, the translation is that you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your animals. So, it's in both
Yes.
places.
However, what's the difference?
Oh, well. I mean, he gives the reason. The reason is different.
So we can make an argument that one is universalistic and one is particularistic. Okay? Meaning, Exodus is a universal call for rest because we are all trying to imitate God. The reason that we rest on Shabbat is because the Creator rested after creating the world. Therefore, humanity rests. However, in Deuteronomy, there is a particularistic reason. Why do we rest? Because we were taken out of Egypt. That then becomes an imperative for why people should rest and why we should make sure that other people rest. So it's a particularistic reason for why we should then think about having other people rest. It's rooted in our story, whereas creation is a universal story, even if we disagree about how the world was created.
There's also more responsibility in when you're looking at the Deuteronomy. I mean, that is sort of, the other one, as you say, is more universalistic. Here it's really more of a it feels like more of a responsibility.
Sure. What is the responsibility, though?
Not just for yourself, but you're to make sure that that happens.
Yes. And what's interesting about this text in Deuteronomy, again, I'm back in verse 14, it says, L'ma'an yanuach avdecha va'amatcha kamocha. Meaning, the reason that you want all of these people to rest is so that your male and female slave can rest like you do. almost as if to say that even the people who are not part of this story should experience the story in the same way that you do, or at least experience the rest in the same way that you do. This is a very different narrative from what we're presented with in the other two stories. At least in terms of Shabbat, the impetus behind Shabbat. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts?
Two main themes to me from Deuteronomy are, one is that you shouldn't worship other gods.
Yes.
Very obsessed with worshiping other gods.
And why would that be an important law or goal or topic to keep harping on?
Because then you won't do what you've been commanded to do.
Good, so that's one reason. Give me another reason.
Doing it.
People were doing it.
Yeah.
Remember, if Deuteronomy is a text that is written in the 7th century, what has already happened in the worldview of the Israelites?
We're being apostate.
That's right, the entire northern kingdom has been destroyed, and what the prophets were warning against was, stop worshiping idols. It's getting in the way of everything. By the way, in the same way that we ask the question, does one God, cause morality? Do we even need a God to cause morality? We can also learn the opposite thing is, just because you have a God doesn't mean that you're going to be moral, or you could worship a God that causes you to be immoral. Right? That God could demand that of you, in which case there's an overemphasis on inappropriate practices connected to idolatry. That's what the prophets were preaching.
The second thing seems to me is that we are commanded to be humble. And that because, whatever we've achieved through the beneficence of God. And whatever happens, whether it's harvests, wealth, or, when you settle in the land and you're fat and happy, don't think that you did this all by yourself. It's only because of what God gave
Sure,
you.
exactly.
And that's a really important.
Right. Now, yeah.
Is the historical context what we read about last week, though, that Josiah is reading to the people, and the temple itself has been defiled with homosexual prostitutes and various other
Idols and stuff like that. Yeah.
So somehow this is reacting to what is actually going on.
Yeah.
And the reason for emphasizing these things is, come on, guys, you're Israelites. You came out. God brought you out of Egypt. You've got to return to.
Right. In a way, Deuteronomy is going to create a narrative, a master narrative for the Jewish people, if you will, that in every generation we experience the consequences of idolatry. You can call idolatry whatever you want. You can call it an actual statue, or you can call it the iPhone. It doesn't really make a difference, but there are many, and by the way, connected to God or not connected to God, connected to multiple gods or connected to one God, there are things that distract us from doing what it is that we need to do. And so in a way, Josiah, Moses, whomever, whichever generation you're speaking to, is trying to redirect our behavior so that we behave the way that perhaps whatever God you believe in would want you to behave.
But that's theology.
That is theology. That's my business. Right. Okay, I just want to conclude with verse 19. Julie, will you read verse? At least read verse 19 through 24.
Okay.
Please.
The Lord spoke those words, those and no more, to your whole congregation at the mountain, with a mighty voice out of the fire and the dense clouds. He inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone, which he gave to me. When you heard the voice out of the darkness, while the mountain was ablaze with fire, you came up to me, all your tribal heads and elders, and said, the Lord our God has just shown us his majestic presence, and we have heard his voice out of the fire. We have seen this day that man may live through God, we have seen this day that man may live, though God has spoken to him. Let us not die then, for this fearsome fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer, we shall die. For what mortal ever heard the voice of the living God speak out of the fire as we did and lived? You go closer and hear all that the Lord our God says, and then you tell us everything that the Lord our God tells you, and we will willingly do it.
So lots of references in this text to the Shema, right? If you listen, if you listen, if you listen. And there's a reference here to Revelation. Right? As part of Moses recounting the story, he recounts something that happened at Mount Sinai, round 1. It's not clear if it's Exodus 20 or Exodus 34, but there was clearly a revelatory moment that included a mighty voice, dense clouds, the scribing of something onto stone, specifically 2 stones, that there was some kind of like dense fog, that there was a kol gadol, a loud voice, that there was smoke and fire and whatever. There was some epic revelatory theophany. Theophany is a fancy word for the revealing of God's face or presence that happened that Moses is recounting in the telling. Is it the Exodus 20 narrative, which is where we first see it? Is it the Exodus 34 narrative, that lesser known text? Is it an Ezekiel-like vision that, with chariots and fire and faces and whatever? It's not clear. But there's some reference to a revelatory moment that takes place, and Moses recounts it in the retelling of the Decalogue. Okay? So let's... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, going forward, the second one we read in Exodus is sprinkled throughout the rest of Deuteronomy.
Isn't it nice? Yeah.
I mean, he focuses on this story,
Yes.
but he doesn't forget the other.
That's right. And actually, there'll be later in Deuteronomy in Parshat Re'eh, there'll be references to the pilgrimage festivals, right? There'll be references to different kinds of idolatry. There'll be different laws that are connecting to honoring and respecting and having long life, like we did connected to honoring your parents. So you actually see them, you're right, sprinkled and peppered throughout the entire text.
And in 7 he talks about that the Lord dislodged all those nations.
Yes, yes.
So it's like, it's all there.
That's right. It's just coming out in a different form. It's interesting to think, is he talking in the future, meaning preempting what's going to happen, or is it a historical reflection of what has already happened? And depending on the way that you look at the authorship, let alone the theology, you can read it both ways, which is cool.